When most people think of a do-over, they think of someone who tries again and again to get something right. Well, my story is about someone who tries again and again to do something very destructive. It was Christmas 1990, and my mother and I are sitting on my grandmother's couch. To the left is my mother's sister, Deborah. On the coffee table in front of us lay several guns. Now, we hadn't planned on having a gift exchange, but Deborah gave me one anyway. A .38 caliber handgun, a box of bullets, a holster, $100, and a note to be read at a later time. Now, I guess at some point the conversation deteriorated because Deborah reached onto a bookshelf, pulled a bullet out of a box, held it between her thumb and forefinger, looked at my mother, and said, "Jana, this has your name on it." Many perpetrators of violent crimes regarding the misuse of firearms have psychological issues that cannot or have not been properly addressed. Fixing the healthcare system so that these people get the proper mental health services that they need will take years of difficult reform. In the meantime, we need to ask ourselves some difficult questions about gun control. At what point does a person become a legitimate threat to themselves and others? At what point does it become the government's ethical responsibility to take away a person's right to bear arms? For the sake of gun violence victims around the country, these questions need to be answered. Crazy by Lisa Sword. I eventually sold the guns that Deborah gave me that Christmas of the 1990s, and I eventually read the note. It was 6 pages long and full of advice. Number 1, always carry your gun with you at all times, even to take out the trash. You don't want to end up in a bag for waste management to pick up. Number 2, never draw your weapon in an effort to save others. If they cared about their lives, they would own a gun. Number 3, you're going to need a gun to back up that mouth. Otherwise, you might end up in a Ted Bundy nightmare with a knife to your throat just before you're dismembered. Number 4, the law of averages says you will outlive me. Make sure you're alive to collect. Now, for most of her adult life, Deborah had fantasized about killing or tried to kill someone. First, her mother, by flinging a pan of hot grease at her head. Then her mother again, by drugging her with medications from the psych wards and nursing homes where she worked. Then my mother, my father, who she said could be felled with a hail of bullets sprayed into the side of his car. The children playing in the street. The neighbor across the road who, she said, looked at her the wrong way. Her co-workers, her supervisor, who at one point had even talked to my mother and said, quote, "I feared for the patients. She unnerved and frightened me. Her stare was pure evil." Now, Deborah could have killed all these people and more by simply going into the house where my grandmother was in the middle stages of dementia and pulling out one of her many weapons. 9s, 45s, 38s, Glocks, an AK-47, a machete, and a mace. And not the pepper spray kind of mace. The ancient kind with the iron rod and the chain and the steel-studded ball. And she had bullets. 40,000 rounds of ammunition. Bullets that would pierce armored cars. Bullets that would burn underwater. Bullets that when they hit the body would explode on contact. So we were quite worried. My mother called the state police. She called the FBI, the county sheriff, and county social services. The county attorney said that there was nothing they could do, that we didn't have any evidence that she was a legitimate threat to herself or others. The county sheriff just said that they would no longer be taking 911 calls at that address because his deputies are young. They have families. And it just wasn't worth it for one old lady. So we were low on options, and the situation was getting more and more unpredictable as time went on. Deborah would occasionally drop by unannounced. And one of us would see her little yellow Ford Fiesta coming down the driveway, and we would say, "Deborah's here." And everyone would drop whatever they were doing, and we would brace ourselves for what might happen next. And what might happen next could be completely uneventful. One time, what might happen next happened on an otherwise completely normal summer afternoon. My mother and Deborah had been in a big argument over the care of my grandmother. We were basically banned from going up to the house to see her, and every time we called, she sounded drugged and weak and out of it, so we were quite worried. And my mother confronted Deborah about this. Deborah completely blew a gasket. She hung up and she was on her way. Now, we knew at any one time Deborah carried at least 2 guns on her, so my mother led me to an upstairs bedroom with a balcony that overlooked the living room. And she walked over to a drawer and pulled out a .38 caliber handgun and handed it to me. I was instructed that if Deborah pulled a gun at any time during the argument, I was to fire. So my mother positioned me behind a closet door with a clear view of the living room, and I'm standing here holding this gun with 2 hands really close to my chin. I have no idea what the hell I'm doing. I've never held a gun before, let alone fired one. I'm 14 years old. And here I am thinking, not what would happen if I hit Deborah, but what would happen if I missed. The argument eventually died down. My mother came back upstairs and took the gun from me. It was around that time that I started having nightmares. That's what I called them when I was sleeping. When I was awake, I called them rehearsals, and there were always 2 versions. The hero's version and the coward's version. In the hero's version, Deborah's little yellow Ford Fiesta comes down the driveway, she barges into the house and shoots my father, wounding him, but not fatally. And then my mother, my brother, and I cower in the living room, begging to her and crying to her not to kill us, but Deborah liked me, so I would stand up, and I would come forward and extend my hand and say, "Deborah, give me the gun." In the coward's version, it was always winter, but the same scenario. Deborah's little yellow Ford Fiesta comes down the driveway, she barges into the house and shoots everyone in my family, and kills everyone, except for me. I escape and I run out the back door and through the woods, even though there's no foliage to protect me, and I can feel her gaze on the back of my head, but I keep running through the bean field to the neighbor's house, and I knock on the door, and someone answers, and the only thing I can say is, "Help us." 2 weeks later, my mom calls back at the house, and she gets no answer. So my parents went up there, and they couldn't get in, so they called the police, who called the bomb squad, who shut down the street in case she had booby-trapped her body. They broke a large window with a firefighter stick, and once they had determined that she had not booby-trapped her body and was merely dead, they unlocked the door. Inside the house, it was very dark. Even though the electricity was working, none of the light bulbs were. That night, Deborah had turned on the heat, got into bed, opened the Bible to the 23rd Psalm, and wrote a 3-page suicide note. She took some tranquilizers, chased them with 2 cans of beer, and then shot herself in the left side of the chest. I heard my dad from the back part of the house say, "Ding dong, the witch is dead." My mom just said, "I'm glad she didn't take anyone else with her."